Welcome to SR Studios Inside the Issue. I'm your host, Casey Pitcher. With us today is Kate Pyontek, whose story, The Big Island, is featured in the fall 2025 issue of Southern Indiana Review. Kate Pyontek is a poet, writer, and artist living in Boston, Massachusetts. Their work appears or is forthcoming in another Chicago magazine, Big Mess, Consequence, Pithead Chapel, and elsewhere. Kate, welcome to Inside the Issue.
Thanks, Casey. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So do you mind maybe starting off with a reading, maybe the first section of The Big Island for us?
Sure. The Big Island. In the 18 months I'd lived on the island, I'd never needed to turn on the kitchen lights in the morning. But when I woke, the room was hidden in shadow. My cell phone rang, and rather than turn on the lights and corroborate the dark, I listened my way to the source. I banged into chairs, stumbled, and nearly tripped over a bag of groceries in my hurry to reach the table. I was agitated before I even answered, and I assumed it was my sister. I was still hurt from the day before and awaiting her apology. I barked my hello. The response was not my sister's quick and nasal Southern California. Instead, I heard slow, familiar Wyomingite vowels. Emily, I said. I was disoriented. We hadn't spoken in 2 years. How are you, Maggie? I could hear a sly smile in her voice, and it set me on edge. It's been a while. I felt resentful, as if the silence since our breakup was her doing. How have you been? She asked again. It was then I understood why she was calling. She'd heard I'd been sick. That was none of her business, and I wondered how she knew. I didn't answer, but she didn't say anything to fill the silence. Just waited. She'd always been infuriating like that. Finally, I said, I'm fine. She laughed at that, in a way that belied her frustration, then sighed. Okay, Margaret. It felt like a win and a good place to call it. We had nothing to talk about anyway. Service isn't good here, I said. I'll have to go now. I hung up before she could reply. I tripped my way to the sliding glass door and poised my fingertips on the glass like an animal ready to jump. Outside, the hurricane's forewind was knocking plumeria flowers off the tree, sending them spiraling. I was annoyed at the mess the storm would make of the yard. Despite my insistence, the storm would come to nothing. I had supplies gathered and ready on the counter. Bottles of water, a flashlight, cans of baked beans, Wonder Bread, a papaya. There was even a case of Ensure left over from when I'd been sick, if it got really bad. I was still holding the phone in one hand. I texted my sister. Talked to Emily recently? You never told her? We broke up, I texted. For fuck's sake, Maggie. Christine wanted me to leave as soon as news of the hurricane hit, and I had been calling and calling. We'd argued. The day before, it had gotten heated. I'd called Christine overdramatic, and she'd called me a coward, both of us seeking to wound as only sisters could. We hadn't spoken since. And now this. She had promised me she wouldn't tell Emily. I tossed the phone on the table away from me so that I wouldn't rashly reply. I paced. Minutes later, the phone buzzed with a new text. Are you okay? How's the storm? I replied before I could think about it. I was still angry about her calling me a coward. Just a little wind, I texted back, should be able to get in one last surf. There was a long moment before the ding of her reply. Have you ever considered trying not to die? Have to work with what I've got, I wrote. Is that what you tell yourself? I kicked into my slippers, grabbed my car keys, and started for the beach.
All right, thank you. So tell us maybe about where this story came from. What its genesis was. I'm interested. I'm interested in this character's story. She's a fascinating character to me. When I was rereading the story, preparing for this, I was like just really drawn to the character again. And it's a cool experience to like, read something and it's been a while and come back to it and be like, no, I'm still really intrigued by her. So I'm just curious where this character and the story came from.
Thank you. That's really kind. So the story came from actually a friend of a friend or a friend of someone I was close to died of cancer. And when she got sick, she didn't tell anyone. And my friend was kind of devastated that, this was how this person withdrew. And I totally understood where she was coming from. Um, but I just thought about that experience of um, how you'd want to hide that kind of experience. And um, from what we heard about the few people she did let see her, this friend of a friend, it seemed like there was a lot of shame involved in it for her.
Hmm.
And so I was very interested in um, that reaction, and also my friend's reaction to, not being able to see her at the end. So I was very interested in that. Um, but this character came from a place of, unlike this person who I think, did not come from a place of anger. It came from more of a place of protecting other people, which does show up in the character a little bit. I think this character was very angry, and just, I was really drawn to this character's anger about it, and how much um, that kind of, not like, she told herself she was protecting people, but not this character. But she's not doing that so much as just kind of giving space for her anger, which she eventually does kind of acknowledge. But for a long time, I think she keeps that from herself. And I think one of the things that's also interesting about this is, the human experience of kind of keeping things from yourself, like not letting yourself know what you're really doing and what you're really feeling. And so I was thinking too about how we kind of will lie to ourselves about how bad something really is or how well we're dealing with it. And she spends a lot of time telling herself that she's fine and she's processed it and she's dealing with it well, and she's not. So that was a big piece of this for me. The other piece of this is I've been to Hawaii, not to the Big Island, but I've been to Oahu twice, and the first time I was on Oahu, there was a hurricane, and I didn't know Hawaii got hurricanes, but they're apparently becoming more of a possibility, I suppose, now that climate change is changing weather patterns, but they have happened there. But um, that was part of, I think, what influenced this, and just that experience too, just the general setting of it.
Yeah, that's what you mentioned about her like lying to herself, right? I mean, she breaks up with Emily, you know, to her way of thinking, or at least what she's telling herself is to protect her from witnessing her die.
Hmm.
And it stings her like when her sister calls her a coward, right? Because it's hitting pretty close to home, and she's unwilling to do that. And I mean, one of the things like the character's anger, I think, is what's is so interesting to me about her because she's quite literally gotten this new lease on life, right? She goes into remission, kind of against all odds. And what I think my favorite part of the character is how complicated her relationship with survival is. That whether she had really come to terms with her impending death or just was telling herself that, either way, she's like angry now that she's gonna live, and that's maybe angry isn't the right word, but she doesn't know what to do with like, okay, now what? I had
Yeah,
I had sort of shaped my limited time around this idea of I think maybe in her mind, going to Hawaii to die away from people, to have some dignity in that or some choice in how she
yeah,
does it. And then it's like, I don't have that anymore, and she doesn't know what to do. And
yeah.
that just struck me as a really fascinatingly complex uh space to be in, to like, our expectation is that she would be incredibly happy and grateful and all of that, and she probably is those things too, but she doesn't act that way. And that's I don't know, I was just really drawn to that, the messiness of that. And it
Thank
felt
you.
it felt I mean, thankfully I've never experienced this or been close to anybody who has, but it felt authentic to me. I could see how someone might, not know what to do with this newfound, you know, rest of her life. Uh,
Right. I mean, I think, when you're in a situation where you have absolutely no control, especially when it's something that's, with cancer, it's like it's in her body. She can't, it's herself. It's not even the situation. It's just herself. And so she has no control over, um, her most immediate experience. And so I think she was trying to find control. And so I think when people try to impose control over something, especially when it doesn't work out, then it becomes very uncomfortable. And so certainly she reacts to that discomfort with more anger, and she doesn't really know what to do with it. She had a plan. Like this was how she was going to survive, dying, was
mhm.
that she had a plan for this. She had it all planned out. And then that didn't work. And so now what? So yeah.
Speaking of the not having control too, I mean, the storm plays into that really nicely. It's this there's the introduction of, well, I mean, the storm is mentioned in the opening, but in the next section, no. Anyway, shortly thereafter, there's a memory of her going to Emily's mom's house or
Yeah.
family home and experiencing a sort of a near miss with a tornado. So
Yeah.
that's already been kind of it's in the story already. And then of course the hurricane is impending in Hawaii. And then with the way the story ends, I think that's another. It was nice. It was a nice sort of echo, right, of these things that's outside of her control. Except she handles that differently, I think, right? Like she doesn't
Yeah.
seem like she goes and probably irresponsibly surfs right when she shouldn't, and
Right.
she goes out driving or she goes to the hotel and on her way back I mean that it's kind of cool how she takes this different approach to this other thing that she can't control,
Hmm.
um that also could be lethal to her.
Yeah.
um what's your, maybe like kind of broadly speaking, what's your writing process like? And then for this particular story, was it typical for you, or was it more something different about this story in the process of writing it?
Yeah. I mean, I think this was kind of typical in some ways, atypical in other ways. For most stories, I generally get an idea of the language piece. I knew like the opening phone call was really important to this story. The character and just her anger around her situation was really important to the start of this story. Setting is always pretty important to the start of a story, and so in those ways, this kind of came from that. And my process is generally very iterative. I'll write a lot and go over it a lot, trying to almost figure out for myself what the story is through the pieces that I put down. So it takes a lot of time. But this story in particular took a lot of time. This was one of the first stories I ever wrote. I started it back, I think, in 2016. So I was working on it for a very long time, and I'd give up on it, put it away, and take it back out. And um, yeah, so it's true to my general process in that it was very iterative, but maybe more iterations than normal. So,
So since it has been around for, I guess, almost a decade now,
mhm.
what was the, I mean, obviously the story was worth the time, of course. And it's pretty clear that you sensed at some point, like, no, this story is not one that I'm going to abandon. It's not one where I figured out what I need to figure out and I can move on or learn what I need to learn. But so what was it about this one that was that I don't want to say took so long. That seems, I don't mean that as like a judgment, but I mean like what was it about the story that you needed that much time? Maybe that's what I was saying.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. I think one of the reasons it took so long was because it was one of the first stories I wrote. Um, and I think I was kind of learning how to write as I wrote this story. So I think that's part of it. I think it was a lot of trying to figure out. I think, thinking about this final version versus where I started, there's so much about this character that wasn't included, and so much that was included that wasn't in the beginning. And so it really was like a question of learning how to tell the story in the right way. I think especially when you're a beginning writer, um, I mean I love workshops and I've been to so many workshops and it's how the story got to where it is. But I think it's difficult, especially when you're starting out, to figure out what advice to take and what advice to um, maybe like hear and acknowledge, but maybe not make changes based on, or not make the suggested changes based on. Um, and I mean, for an example, the Wyoming scene, the brief scene with the tornado, I got advice from someone who I admire and who I think, was coming from the right place of saying this doesn't relate to the story. And so I took it out for a long time, and it just bothered me because that felt like a really important piece of the story to me. But I agreed that it didn't seem to match with the rest of the story. But what I needed to do with that piece was to figure out how to explain to the reader why it was important to the story and not take it out. And that's, a minor kind of change, but it's a response to feedback that I think is hard for an early writer to understand. And so I had to get more experience trying to figure out, how you know for yourself. Um, there was another scene that people loved that I kept in the story for a very long time, but was not actually part of the story. And so it's, I think, summarized in like a sentence now that she wiped out once in while surfing, but it was a whole big scene. But what happened with that was keeping it in there, although people loved it, it kind of pulled the story in a wrong direction. And so I think that that's another piece of, I think, learning to write the story and learning to write in general has been what's not giving up, what the story is trying to say to keep in or take out pieces that you think are good or bad. It has to be what does the story actually require to be told and not what's the most entertaining or and that's complicated since what we're doing is we're trying to, keep attention and cause emotions. And so it's hard to know which one where you are in that process.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. The idea that, I like how you talk about you were learning to write while learning to write this story and like how to tell
Yeah.
this story. And I'm not a very sort of like I don't know, like woo about this, but there is something about like the story teaching us how to tell it at the same time. Like figuring out not so much story, but I mean figuring out to like how to tell this particular story, what's necessary for this story might be different for another story. And it's like part of it is the story revealing something to you in the process of what's necessary and what isn't.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I wish there was a shortcut for that.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I tell students same thing, some of the similar things about, they're undergrads, but this idea of like filtering workshop voices, right? And figuring out like, of course, as you said, listening and processing everything, but learning to listen, you know, to the right advice coming from the right person, and kind of like
Yeah.
thinking about, yeah, I mean, that's all. That's like I said, I wish there was an easy way. I wish there was wish there were like sort of nice rules of thumb for that, but there
Yeah,
aren't.
it's
Um,
so hard because I mean, when someone t gives you feedback, they're giving you advice. They just might not, they're giving you really important information. Something is not working.
yeah,
But the diagnosis that gets translated in workshop is sometimes not even what is not working for them. So it's such a, yeah,
yeah.
it's really hard. It's really tough
And I think it's harder to, I noticed this, the better the story, the harder it is.
for sure. Yeah.
When the stories that have fundamental issues are easy to talk about, and
Hmm.
but it's the ones especially where the writer seems to understand what they're doing.
Yeah.
And it's the adjustments they're gonna I try to talk to them about, like you're making like dozens of small adjustments to the story rather than like changing the setting or changing the point of
Right.
view or adding a character. It's much more that kind of stuff that just really does take time. And I don't think,
Yeah.
they don't understand yet that it might take them 2 years or 10
Right.
years
Or 10 years. Yeah.
to really and ultimately what matters is the story, right? And
Yeah.
the story is it's worth the time. If I mean, if it clearly is worth the time, and I think that it is something about um, giving the story the time it takes. So since this story did take time, and what was your revision process? Like, I assume you weren't revising this the entire time, probably putting it away and coming back
Yeah.
to it. And um, what's normal revision for you?
What's normal revision for me? Like, what's my normal revision process?
Yeah,
Or,
yeah.
yeah, I think I like to print things out and take a pen and work on paper. I don't know, it's always been um, just works better for me. I'll handwrite stories sometimes, so it might be part of it. I've always journaled, like for my whole life, I've journaled in by hand, so I think that's just kind of how I think on paper. Um, so a lot of marking up pages, typing them up, printing them out again, lots of workshops, and yeah, I think think like I've probably done the thing where you cut pieces out and try to reorder them.
Mhm.
I've probably done that. It's a lot of thinking about where are people confused? How can I explain that? Are there pieces that I'm missing? How do I figure those pieces out? Um, there's just multiple passes thinking about what's the psychology of the character and like have I like really thought about what she's going through, have I thought about like all the other characters, what they're going through, have I thought about the setting enough, are there things I can do more of on a sentence level? It's just multiple iterations of different levels of the story.
It's funny you mentioned the literal cutting and pasting. I no joke mentioned this today in class where I'm teaching a nonfiction workshop, and I said, sometimes print it out and lay it on the table or tape it to the wall, just to see, it gives you that kind of, global view. And I think, students, younger students who, they've never not worked on a word processing. So
Yeah.
there's this, it turns it into something like tactile and physical and,
Yes.
like of course there's no cure all here, but it's just like something to shake it up, make you
Yeah.
see the piece, quite literally see it differently. And I don't know if they'll listen to me or not, but I try to get them to at least experiment and try. Um,
It's a great way to, yeah, I think taking it off the screen and bringing it into the real world, you can
Mhm.
interact with it differently. It changes how you think about it. So
Yeah.
I think it's a great tip. They should listen to
Yeah. Well, I'll be sure to be sure to tell them. Uh,
you.
I do print drafts off too. I think that's really important to me to have the pen, to have, when I get a draft where I think it's doing something, to print it off and to go through and to think, think that way. It gives me, it actually, it almost for me, it's like I'm reading a workshop story. I kind of
Yeah.
approach it that way. And there's something about having it in my hand that's like, oh, well, I'm just reading a story like I would to prep for a workshop. So it's,
Yep.
I usually have to have some distance from it, a little bit of time away from it to do that. But, I think the approaching in that hard copy is, it's invaluable to me as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, um, so we'll shift gears a little bit. What were some important books for you starting out, or important writers that inspired you or showed you something that you didn't know could be done when you were first starting out?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I'm thinking about this. I know Bonnie Jo Campbell comes to mind as somebody who was really important to me when I first started writing short fiction. Um, I grew up very much as a novel reader, but I didn't read a lot of short fiction. So when I started writing short fiction, um, I kind of had to like teach myself the moves of it and the shape of it. But Bonnie Jo Campbell was somebody whose work I loved. American Salvage
Yeah,
was the book that I love. Yeah,
it's a fantastic
um,
collection.
so it's so good. I have loved Alice Munro, which feels complicated now, but I just do love her stories. I think the way she deals with time has been very influential for me. And the way like that she looks at the psychology of characters. Um, Trying to think of like what books are behind me. Uh yeah, I think I don't know who else short story wise. I'm trying to think of who I was reading 10 years ago. Um
That American Salvage is cool because I really like the it's been a while, but the variety of stories, like there's I think the only reason I remember the title, I think I've given it to students before. I think it's called Solutions to Brian's Problem or something, and it's got like numbers 1 through 5, so it's almost like
Okay,
four
yes.
pieces, and it's like four alternate solutions to a problem.
Yeah,
Um, that I thought that was really cool. I was like, oh yeah, that you can totally do that. Like, it
yeah,
wouldn't have been something that I would have thought of otherwise. Um, yeah, yeah, people would do well to read her for sure.
for sure.
Um, so what about other writers? Unfortunately, Bonnie Jo Campbell probably isn't read as widely as you and I would hope she is, but other writers that you think we should be reading.
Well, as you were talking about short stories that take different forms, I was thinking of Samantha Hunt, and I can't remember the story, but she does have those two stories at the front and the back of the collection, The Dark Dark, and they kind of not quite mirror each other, but they do reflect each other. And I think that's like so cool how she does that. Um, Home Remedies is a collection of short stories, and I am completely blanking on the author's name right now. Um, who else?
I don't know if that title's not ringing a bell for me, but that doesn't mean I'm not familiar with it. I just can't think of it. It's is it newer?
It's probably 6 years old, 5 years old. Yeah.
That's new. I still call that new.
Um, for newer things, I just read Kitty Kitamura's edition. I love Kitty Kitamura. Um, I have not read the new Sally Rooney, but I do love Sally Rooney. Um, I'm trying to think who else. Uh, Alexander Cheese, Edinburgh, for one thing. I love that book.
I've only
Completely blank.
read of his. I think I've read the
Queen of the Night's the famous one.
I've only read the
Fiction.
essay collection.
Oh, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel.
Yeah, that one. I really
That
like.
one's really good. Incredible collection of essays. Yeah, I love that.
Um, so what are you currently working on, or where might other people do you have any stories coming out or anything you're focused on at the moment?
I'm working on a bunch of things at the moment. I'm working a little bit on a novel. I am working on some short stories. I have a poem coming out, I think later this spring. I'm working on a collection of poetry. I've been working on poetry a lot more lately, and that's been kind of my focus. But I am slowly getting back to fiction now. So, yeah.
Do you not that you have to choose. I mean, I
Mm.
would. I mean, I choose fiction, but do you see like? I mean, do you think of it that way, or do you approach? I guess I'm curious, like, especially for those writers, the more talented of us who can do both.
It's more scattered.
Is it okay? I didn't know if
I
you
mean,
sort of knew what you were like. If if you're like, I'm in fiction mode or I'm in poetry
mm,
mode. Like, is it what? Yeah, I'm just curious about that.
oh, I see. Yeah. I think that when I think about a new project, I tend to think in a shape of something, but it doesn't necessarily always keep that shape, but usually I'd say it does. But I write essays as well, and I think there's some like permeability, I guess. I don't know. Between poems and essays, sometimes it gets you can switch. Sometimes between I think poems and fiction, sometimes you can switch. But they're very different things, generally, I think. So you just kind of know what you're making. I think it's kind of like it's a weird analogy, but like when you go to decide to cook something, you just kind of figure out what you're making, and just kind of takes that shape. And
Okay.
sometimes you think maybe I'd try that again a different way, but um, yeah, I think I started writing fiction, and I was always a fiction reader growing up. I never really got into poetry, but someone told me that writing poetry would help my fiction. And so that's what I wanted. I wanted to do whatever I could to make my fiction better. So I started taking poetry classes, and I just discovered that I liked them. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's always I'm just always curious about, the writers who do both. And lots of writers do both, but the ones who do both really well, I'm always curious like how that, if it is just this, you know, the idea or image, whatever it is, whatever the spark is, thing that gets you writing, and then it finds its form, or if you're thinking in terms of, like, or if the ideas sort of come to you, you know, like you mentioned shapes, right? If it comes to you in the shape of a poem versus the shape of a story. And I think you're right. I mean, I think poems and essays, there's a lot of fertile ground between the two.
Yeah.
Um,
But I do think they have their own shapes. It's like a mode of mode of storytelling feels like I'm mixing this up, but it's a mode of sharing, I guess.
hmm.
And poems and fiction feel very different. I feel it's like just different projects, different processes. So I think there is kind of that initial question of, what are we here to do? And so that kind of answers that for you.
No, that's very cool. I wish I were better able to do that. I might get an idea for a poem once every 10 years, and it's like one poem, and then I usually can't execute it. It's just sort of like, oh, that might be a good poem. But yeah, I just don't, unfortunately, I don't think that way. And that's why I'm interested in and fascinated by the people that can switch that way from prose to poetry. I think that's just a really cool, and I always try to push my students not to identify themselves as, oh, I'm a fiction writer, I'm a poet. It's like, well, can't you be both? Wouldn't it be
Yeah.
great to be able to do both of those things really well instead of just choosing? Because I wish I would have spent more time learning to write poetry, in grad school and all that. So, um, okay, so you can find The Big Island in the fall 2025 issue of SIR. You can go to usi.edu/SIR to find out how to get a copy. Link will be below in the description. Thank you again, Kate. It was such a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you for sending us such a wonderful story.
Thank you, Casey. This was wonderful.
All right.